Effects by country. The majority of countries set up relief programs, and most underwent some sort of political upheaval, pushing them to the right. Many of the countries in Europe and Latin America that were democracies saw their democratic governments overthrown by some form of dictatorship or authoritarian rule, most famously in Germany in 1933. The Dominion of Newfoundland abandoned its autonomy within the British Empire, becoming the only region ever to voluntarily relinquish democracy. There, too, were severe impacts across the Middle East and North Africa, including economic decline, which led to social unrest. Argentina, the decline in foreign trade hit Argentina hard. The British decision to stop importing Argentine beef led to the signing of the Roca-Runciman Treaty, which preserved a quota in exchange for significant concessions to British exports. By 1935, the economy had recovered to 1929 levels, and the same year, the Central Bank of Argentina was formed. However, the Great Depression was the last time when Argentina was one of the richer countries of the world, as it stopped growing in the decades thereafter and became underdeveloped. Australia's dependence on agricultural and industrial exports meant it was one of the hardest hit developed countries. Falling export demand and commodity prices placed massive downward pressures on wages. Unemployment reached a record high of 29% in 1932, with incidents of civil unrest becoming common. After 1932, an increase in wool and meat prices led to a gradual recovery. Canada, harshly affected by both the global economic downturn and the Dust Bowl, Canadian industrial production had by 1932 fallen to only 58% of its 1929 figure, the second lowest level in the world after the United States, and well behind countries such as Britain, which fell to only 83% of the 1929 level. Total national income fell to 56% of the 1929 level, again worse than any country apart from the United States. Unemployment reached 27% at the depth of the Depression in 1933. Chile. The League of Nations labeled Chile the country hardest hit by the Great Depression because 80% of government revenue came from exports of copper and nitrates, which were in low demand. Chile initially felt the impact of the Great Depression in 1930 when GDP dropped 14%, mining income declined 27%, and export earnings fell 28%. By 1932, GDP had shrunk to less than half of what it had been in 1929, exacting a terrible toll in unemployment and business failures. Influenced profoundly by the Great Depression, many government leaders promoted the development of local industry in an effort to insulate the economy from future external shocks. After 6 years of government austerity measures which succeeded in re-establishing Chile's creditworthiness, Chileans elected to office during the 1938 to 58 period a succession of center and left-of-center governments interested in promoting economic growth through government intervention. Prompted in part by the devastating 1939 Chilean earthquake, the Popular Front government of Pedro Aguirre Cerda created the Production Development Corporation, Corporación de Fomento de la Producción, CORFO, to encourage, with subsidies and direct investments, an ambitious program of import substitution industrialization. Consequently, as in other Latin American countries, protectionism became an entrenched aspect of the Chilean economy. China was largely unaffected by the Depression, mainly by having stuck to the silver standard. However, the U.S. Silver Purchase Act of 1934 created an intolerable demand on China's silver coins, and so eventually the silver standard was officially abandoned in 1935 in favor of the four Chinese national banks' legal note issues. China and the British colony of Hong Kong, which followed suit in this regard in September 1935, would be the last to abandon the silver standard. In addition, the nationalist government also acted energetically to modernize the legal and penal systems, stabilize prices, amortize debts, reform the banking and currency systems, build railroads and highways, improve public health facilities, legislate against traffic in narcotics, and augment industrial and agricultural production. On November 3, 1935, the government instituted the fiat currency FDIC reform, immediately stabilizing prices and also raising revenues for the government. European African colonies. The sharp fall in commodity prices and the steep decline in exports hurt the economies of the European colonies in Africa and Asia. The agricultural sector was especially hard hit. For example, sisal had recently become a major export crop in Kenya and Tanganyika. During the Depression, it suffered severely from low prices and marketing problems that affected all colonial commodities in Africa. Sisal producers established centralized controls for the export of their fiber. There was widespread unemployment and hardship among peasants, laborers, colonial auxiliaries, and artisans. The budgets of colonial governments were cut, which forced the reduction in ongoing infrastructure projects, such as the building and upgrading of roads, ports, and communications. The budget cuts delayed the schedule for creating systems of higher education. The Depression severely hurt the export-based Belgian Congo economy because of the drop in international demand for raw materials and for agricultural products. For example, the price of peanuts fell from 125 to 25 centimes. In some areas, as in the Katanga mining region, employment declined by 70%. In the country as a whole, the wage labor force decreased by 72,000 people, and many men returned to their villages. In Leopoldville, the population decreased by 33% because of this labor migration. Political protests were not common. However, there was a growing demand that the paternalistic claims be honored by colonial governments to respond vigorously. The theme was that economic reforms were more urgently needed than political reforms. French West Africa launched an extensive program of educational reform in which rural schools, designed to modernize agriculture, would stem the flow of underemployed farm workers to cities where unemployment was high. Students were trained in traditional arts, crafts, and farming techniques, and were then expected to return to their own villages and towns. France. The crisis affected France a bit later than other countries, hitting hard around 1931. While the 1920s saw growth at a strong rate of 4.43% per year, during the 1930s, the rate fell to only 0.63%. The Depression was relatively mild. Unemployment levels peaked at less than 5%, and the fall in production was at most 20% below the 1929 output. France also had no major banking crisis. However, the Depression had drastic effects on the local economy, and partly explains the February 6, 1934 riots, and even more the formation of the Popular Front, led by SFIO socialist leader Léon Blum, which won the elections in 1936. Ultra-nationalist groups also saw increased popularity, though democracy prevailed into World War II. France's relatively high degree of self-sufficiency meant the damage was considerably less than in neighboring states like Germany. Germany. The Great Depression hit Germany hard. The impact of the Wall Street crash forced American banks to end the new loans that had been funding the repayments under the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. The financial crisis escalated out of control in mid-1931, starting with the collapse of the Credit Anstalt in Vienna in May. This put heavy pressure on Germany, which was already in political turmoil with the rise in violence of National Socialist and Communist movements, as well as with investor nervousness at harsh government financial policies. Investors withdrew their short-term money from Germany as confidence spiraled downward. The Reichsbank lost 150 million marks in the first week of June, 540 million in the second, and 150 million in 2 days, June 19th to 20th. Collapse was at hand. U.S. President Herbert Hoover called for a moratorium on payment of war reparations. This angered Paris, which depended on a steady flow of German payments, but it slowed the crisis down, and the moratorium was agreed to in July 1931. An international conference in London later in July produced no agreements, but on the 19th of August, a standstill agreement froze Germany's foreign liabilities for 6 months. Germany received emergency funding from private banks in New York, as well as the Bank of International Settlements and the Bank of England. The funding only slowed the process. Industrial failures began in Germany. A major bank closed in July, and a 2-day holiday for all German banks was declared. Business failures became more frequent in July and spread to Romania and Hungary. In 1932, 90% of German reparation payments were canceled. In the 1950s, Germany repaid all its missed reparations debts. Widespread unemployment reached 25%, as every sector was hurt. The government did not increase government spending to deal with Germany's growing crisis, as they were afraid that a high spending policy could lead to a return of the hyperinflation that had affected Germany in 1923. Germany's Weimar Republic was hit hard by the Depression, as American loans to help rebuild the German economy now stopped.